Hello. Given current global events, I've been thinking a lot about one of my favorite writers ever, and that's Nikolai Gogol, who was Ukrainian. He's often thought of as a Russian writer, but he was born and raised in the Ukraine, and many of his work is set in the Ukraine. So I tend to think of him as a Ukrainian writer. Like I said, I've been thinking about him a lot lately. And yesterday I read for the first time, actually, one of his better known works, and that's The Inspector General, which is a hilarious play. It's essentially a farce and a satire, although, as I understand it, Gogol did not consider it a satire. He did not have a political agenda in anything he wrote, in my opinion, although it has often been kind of hijacked into that purpose. But in this case, it's understandable to read this as kind of a political satire. It is hilarious, and I do think it's a good way to start talking about him because I think it's kind of indicative of what most people tend to appreciate most about Gogol, and that's his sense of humor. His works, and I've read most of them at this point, or at least most of the ones that are translated into English, are hilarious. That's just kind of at the base level what they tend to do. Although there's a whole lot more going on. I think he's at heart a comic writer. Um, I'm actually, as I'm saying that, I'm not convinced, but I'll be getting to the complexity of that later on. They're hilarious, hilarious stories. I laugh out loud alone reading Gogol often, which is something that I don't think most people do unless what they're reading is hilarious, and he is. Um, but there's also, I think, and I'm not alone in thinking this, obviously, there's a lot of kind of literary movements that came into maturity in the 20th century that are very much anticipated in Gogol. And I'm going to be talking mostly about his short stories. I, of course, have read Dead Souls, which is a beautiful, wonderful, weird book. I highly recommend it. Don't read part two, it's awful, but part one is a masterpiece. But his short stories, he's my personal favorite short story writer other than Borges. And I think there's some good reasons for that. I think that especially in his early stories, which tend to be kind of pastoral stories set in the Ukrainian countryside, there is an element of magical realism in the sense that they are kind of imbued with Ukrainian folklore in a way that it just is kind of a natural part of the environment and the tone and the atmosphere of the stories. So it has that kind of magical realist taking for granted these things. Although that's kind of complicated by the fact that he claims to be drawing from Ukrainian folklore when in fact he's in always. I'm thinking of his story Vi, which is a wonderful, weird comedy slash folktale slash horror story, which he claims to have deriven from Ukrainian folklore. Although, as I understand, there's never been any evidence found of that story in any kind of Ukrainian folklore. But also St. John's Eve, which is a wonderful story. And another thing that those early stories do, and to a lesser extent his later stories, and also in Dead Souls, particularly in the final pages of the first part, is there is a strong current of romanticism. He has these long, beautiful passages where he's kind of waxing poetical and going on these kind of poetic digressions. And there's a certain there's a certain sense that you get that perhaps it's done ironically. You're never quite sure where your footing is with Gogol. That's one of the things I love about him. But there's also a sense that it's intensely sincere when he kind of goes on those romantic digressions. And whether or not it's sincere or ironic, they are beautifully written, and they do contribute a lot to the tone and the atmosphere of these stories, which is another thing that these stories do, and the book, is the tone is constantly shifting in a way that would feel amateurish if it was in the hands of anyone less than what I consider to be a genius. But I'll kind of get to that more a little later. Wanted to move on to what perhaps Gogol is better known for than his romanticism and his magic realism, which is kind of his grotesque, surreal tendencies as a writer. And those, I think, are apparent in the early Ukrainian stories, but also certainly more apparent in the later stories, which are set in kind of urban areas in Russia, like The Overcoat, which is probably his most famous work. It's a wonderful story. Um, but also, what's it called? I'm sorry. Oh, Nevsky Prospect. is another great example of that, and The Nose, of course, and Diaries of a Madman. These are great, neurotic, paranoid stories with strong surrealist elements, obviously, but they also have a weird kind of flight of fancy thing. I think surrealism often tends to get bogged down, as much as I love it, in kind of cynicism and being subversive for its own sake, which turns into kind of a social commentary, which I think is contrary to what Gogol was trying to do. What really happens in these stories are grotesque, but often beautiful and weird flights of fancy. And that's something that you will find also in, now that I think about it, in Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, which in my opinion, it reads very much like if Gogol had lived into the Soviet Union and was writing. So yes, there's the grotesquerie. But all of this is to say that his stories are these constantly shifting kind of not puzzles. They're not puzzles in the sense of like a Borges story where you feel like he's one step ahead of you at all time. They're just these flowing things without any real point. And if that sounds like a criticism, it's really not. It's a wonderful thing. They're like dreams. Unless you have some kind of Freudian or prophetic interpretation of dreams, they serve no real um, function as narratives, other than their own kind of fabulousness, and that's the sense I get from Gogol, where you have these stories that are kind of shifting between flights of fantasy and humor and farce, and then grotesque nightmare, and then often being wrapped up in this very kind of too neat and cozy romantic digression. It's just this weird um, combination of elements that turn into an unbelievably one of a kind of story in almost every case. Um, and that's, I think, what I love most about Gogol is that he feels so removed from any other kind of uh, reading I've done. And like I said, of course, there are the germs of later literary movements in his books, and of course, like I was saying, surrealism and magical realism. And a lot of people consider him a realist author. I don't really get that, but that is thrown out there often. Um, but they're just, you can't call him any of those things. He seems to, it's a weird thing. Like when you read him, when you read many writers, you can kind of situate them in their literary historical context to a certain extent. And I'm no expert, but I've read a fair amount, and generally I can kind of see where they're coming from. With a writer like Gogol, you get the sense that he is only using his own head as a foundation for his creativity. It's a very weird. It's like if he was writing in a vacuum almost, or at least a literary vacuum. It's a weird thing. Like the first time I read him, I was just mesmerized by how unusual and how unlike anything else I've ever read it is, and that remains true. The only other writers I can think of that I think kind of exhibit that quality would be two of my other favorite writers, and that's Nathaniel Hawthorne and Emily not Dickinson, although I guess to a certain extent Emily Dickinson, but I was going to say Emily Bronte. Um, but even with them, I feel like with Hawthorne, he's kind of responding to romanticism and transcendentalism, I think. And of course, Emily Bronte was certainly responding to romanticism. Gogol, I think, is something else. It's just a truly one of a kind reading experience and writer. And unfortunately, he died far too young. We could have a lot more work from him, so it's kind of tragic. But yeah, I just wanted to take this occasion to talk about one of my favorite writers, who happened to be a Ukrainian. Let me know what you guys think of Gogol, if you think I'm totally wrong about everything I said about him. And look forward to hearing from you, and hope you have a good day. Thanks for watching.